The cedar jewelry box was more beautiful than I'd imagined. The craftsman in Langley had spent 6 weeks on it, hand-carving Sophie's initials into the lid with a detail that made me think of the forests I'd spent 40 years turning into a living. My granddaughter was graduating from UBC on Saturday, a degree in environmental science. Of all things, the granddaughter of a timberman, dedicating her life to protecting the trees I'd harvested. I couldn't have been prouder if she'd announced she was running the country. 67 years old, and I still got emotional over things like that. The craftsman wrapped the box carefully in cloth while I signed the receipt. $820, worth every cent. I tucked it under my arm and walked toward my truck in the parking lot, already thinking about the dinner reservation I'd made at the restaurant in Yaletown for after the ceremony. 12 people. Claire and Derek, Sophie's university friends, my old colleague Bill from the mill, a few cousins who'd driven in from Kelowna. A proper celebration. My phone buzzed in my jacket pocket. I assumed it was Claire confirming the parking arrangements for Saturday. She'd texted me 3 times that week about logistics, each message carrying that particular tone she'd developed lately, over-solicitous, slightly too careful, like she was handling something fragile. I'd told myself it was just the stress of planning a family event. I'd been telling myself a lot of things lately. The message wasn't from Claire. It was from a number I didn't recognize, a 604 area code with no contact name attached. The preview showed only the beginning of the text. Please read this before Saturday. I'm sorry I can't tell you who I am, but I stood beside my truck in the parking lot and opened the full message. Please read this before Saturday. I'm sorry I can't tell you who I am, but what's being planned will destroy you financially and legally if you don't know about it first. I've attached 3 documents. Please look at them carefully. Don't let them know you've seen this. 3 PDF files were attached. My hands were steady. 40 years of running a business teaches you to keep your hands steady when your chest is anything but. I sat in the driver's seat and opened the first document. It was a legal filing prepared by a firm called Alderton & Cole in downtown Vancouver. The heading read, Application for Representation Agreement, Section 9, Representation Agreement Act of British Columbia. Subject, Harold James Kowalski. My name. On a legal document I had never seen, never signed, never authorized. A representation agreement under Section 9 of the BC legislation would give someone the authority to make financial and legal decisions on my behalf. It was the kind of document you signed voluntarily when you trusted someone completely, or the kind that got pushed through the courts when a family claimed you were no longer capable of managing your own affairs. I read the supporting affidavit attached to the filing. The language was careful and clinical, the way legal language always is when it's doing something monstrous. Mr. Kowalski has demonstrated a pattern of impaired judgment in recent business decisions, has shown increasing confusion during family discussions, has expressed difficulty recalling financial commitments. Family members have expressed concern regarding his capacity to manage complex business affairs. The words sat on the screen, and I read them 3 times. Then I opened the second document. It was an email thread between my daughter and a psychiatrist named Dr. Randall Forsyth, who listed himself as a specialist in geriatric assessment and capacity evaluation. Claire's first email was dated 9 weeks earlier. Dr. Forsyth, my father is 67 and runs a company that employs 31 people in Abbotsford. We've noticed significant changes in his decision-making over the past 18 months. His business partner retired last year, and Dad has been struggling to manage on his own. We're very concerned. We need an independent assessment of his capacity before he makes any more decisions that could harm the company and its employees. Dr. Forsyth's reply came the following day. Mrs. Ashworth, I understand the difficulty of these situations. I can arrange a consultation at my office, and if the circumstances support it, I can provide a written assessment to accompany your legal application. My fees for these sensitive family matters are outlined in the attached document. Typically, these assessments are completed within a 2-week window once we've established the necessary background. I didn't move for a long time after reading that. Outside the truck, a young family was loading groceries into an SUV. A woman in a yellow jacket was walking a golden retriever along the sidewalk. The parking lot of a furniture shop in Langley, British Columbia, on a perfectly ordinary Thursday afternoon, and I was sitting in my truck reading documents that proved my daughter was trying to have me declared mentally incompetent. The third document was the one that turned my stomach completely. It was a spreadsheet, and I recognized the formatting immediately as Derek's work. My son-in-law had a particular way of organizing financial data, color-coded columns and nested formulas, something he was proud of. Fraser Valley Timber Supply was itemized in meticulous detail. The land and equipment holdings, the fleet of trucks, the client contracts, and their estimated annual value. The commercial property in Abbotsford that I'd purchased outright 12 years ago. Everything totaled and subtotaled at the bottom of the sheet, with a handwritten note in the margin: liquid after restructuring, approx $4, 1 MCAD. More than enough. Derek reviewed Sept 14. I sat in that parking lot for 27 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard and made myself breathe slowly, the way I used to when a deal was going badly and I couldn't afford to show panic. 40 years of business. The recession of the early 90s that nearly finished us. The years when Margaret was sick and I was running the company on 4 hours of sleep and sheer stubbornness. I had survived everything the world had thrown at me. My daughter had decided to steal my life's work. I drove east on the Trans-Canada, not toward my house in Chilliwack, but past it, all the way to the pull-off by the Harrison River, where Margaret and I used to stop on long drives. I sat there with the engine off and the windows down and listened to the water and tried to understand what I was going to do. The unknown number. That was the first thing I needed to understand. Someone had access to those documents, someone who knew what was being planned, and they'd taken a risk to warn me. They'd said they couldn't tell me who they were, but they'd used a 604 number, a lower mainland area code. Someone close. My phone rang. Claire. I answered on the third ring and kept my voice exactly the way it always was. Hey, sweetheart. What's up? Dad, just checking in. You're still coming for dinner tomorrow night, right? Derek's making his risotto. I'd eaten Derek's risotto a dozen times. Now the thought of sitting at their kitchen table made me feel sick in a way I hadn't felt since the week after Margaret died. I'll be there. Should I bring wine? Just bring yourself. We're so excited about Saturday. Sophie can't stop talking about seeing you at the ceremony. I can't wait. The lie was so simple it frightened me. I'll see you tomorrow, sweetheart. After I hung up, I sat by the river for another hour. Then I drove back toward the city with a plan beginning to form in the part of my mind that had navigated 40 years of contracts and suppliers and market swings. The same cold, methodical part that Margaret used to call my mill brain. She said it was both my best quality and my most dangerous one. That evening, I called Patricia Chen. Patricia had been my company's senior bookkeeper for 22 years. She'd joined Fraser Valley Timber when Sophie was still in diapers, and she knew the company's finances better than I did. I trusted her with things I didn't trust many people with. She answered on the first ring, which told me she'd been waiting. Harold, I was hoping you'd call. Was it you? I asked, already knowing. A pause. I couldn't sign my name to it. Derek has been in those files for months, and I didn't know who else knew, and I was scared. I'm sorry I didn't come to you sooner. I kept hoping I was wrong. You weren't wrong. I sat down at my kitchen table with a legal pad in front of me. Tell me everything you know. Patricia told me about the quiet afternoon in July, when she'd come back to the office early from lunch and found Derek at the photocopier. He worked at a financial advisory firm in Burnaby, and he had no business being at my company's photocopier. He'd been flustered, claimed he was just dropping something off for Claire. Patricia had thought nothing of it until she noticed, weeks later, that certain client contracts and asset summaries had been accessed in the filing system without her authorization. Then she'd heard Derek on the phone in the hallway outside the conference room, using a name she recognized, Alderton and Cole. She'd looked them up that evening at home. They specialize in elder law and incapacity proceedings, she said. Harold, I've been sick about this for 6 weeks. You did the right thing, I told her. Keep this between us for now. Don't change anything at work. Behave as if you know nothing. After I hung up with Patricia, I poured 2 fingers of rye whiskey, 40 Creek, the bottle I kept for serious occasions, and sat at the table with my legal pad. Old habits. When a problem is too large to feel, you break it into smaller pieces and write them down. Item 1. Derek's motivation. The scheme was too desperate, too risky for someone acting out of ordinary greed. There had to be a specific pressure behind it, something with a deadline. I needed to know what that was. Item 2. Dr. Forsyth, a psychiatrist who provided capacity assessments for legal proceedings for a fee with a turnaround time of 2 weeks. That was either a man who genuinely believed in protecting vulnerable adults or a man who provided whatever outcome his clients required. I needed to know which. Item 3. My own legal position. Whatever I did next, I needed it locked down before Saturday. Friday morning I called Martin Okafor, the lawyer who had incorporated Fraser Valley Timber Supply in 1989 and handled every significant legal matter of my professional life since. He was 64, sharp as ever, and when I finished explaining the situation, he was quiet for a long moment. Harold, this is a serious matter. What they're attempting is fraudulent misuse of the Adult Guardianship Act. If you want, we can go to the RCMP right now. Not yet, I said. I want something more permanent. Martin came to my office that afternoon and we worked until 7 in the evening. He brought a colleague, a forensic accountant named Sandra Beaumont, who spent 3 hours going through everything Patricia could provide about the financial records Derek had accessed. By the time we finished, the picture was clear. Derek's problem was gambling. Online sports betting, mostly, through accounts held under a cousin's name, something Sandra found by tracing a pattern of cash withdrawals and third-party transfers over 18 months. The total he'd lost was somewhere above $340,000. He'd borrowed against their home equity, run through their savings, and was now facing collection calls from 2 private lenders who operated in a way that made the word informal feel like a significant understatement. He needed money quickly, and he needed a lot of it. My company was the only source large enough. The timeline makes sense, Sandra said, spreading her notes across my desk. The representation agreement filing, the psychiatric assessment scheduled for next week, the graduation dinner Saturday. They've been building toward a moment when you'd be surrounded by family, perhaps feeling generous and celebratory, and they'd introduce the idea of giving Derek more involvement in the company finances. The legal groundwork was being laid in case you refused. Martin nodded slowly. They weren't planning to ask permission. They were planning to take it. I drove home through Abbotsford in the dark and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. The house was quiet. Margaret's reading chair was still in the corner of the living room where she'd left it, still angled toward the window the way she'd liked it. I sat in my own chair across from it and thought about my daughter. Claire was 50 years old. I had walked her to her first day of school. I had held her hand in the hospital the night Sophie was born. I had paid for 2 rounds of fertility treatments before Sophie, never once mentioning it to another soul because Claire had asked me not to. When her first marriage ended, and she was alone with a 3-year-old and no savings, I had given her $50,000 without calling it a loan, because I knew she'd pay it back if she could and I didn't need her to. Derek, I had never fully trusted. But I had accepted him because Claire loved him and Sophie adored him, and I told myself that a man who was good to my grandchild couldn't be entirely bad. I had been wrong about that. Saturday morning, I put on my good suit, the charcoal one Margaret had helped me choose for Sophie's high school graduation, and drove to the UBC campus in Vancouver. The ceremony was held outdoors on a clear October morning, one of those days when the mountains above the city look close enough to touch. I found my seat and watched my granddaughter walk across the stage in her black gown, and I clapped until my hands hurt, and none of the thoughts crowding the back of my mind touched that moment. I gave myself that much. Afterward, we took photographs on the lawn, Sophie still in her gown, laughing at something one of her friends said. Claire hugged me and said I looked wonderful. Derek shook my hand firmly, his eyes steady, nothing in his face suggesting he knew what I'd spent the past 48 hours doing. He was better at this than I'd given him credit for. The restaurant in Yaletown was a steakhouse with exposed brick walls and a wine list that made Martin wince. When I showed it to him, he'd insisted on coming, sitting 2 tables away with his wife, available if needed. I'd also arranged for Patricia to join the dinner. She sat at the far end of the table, near Sophie's university friends, looking more composed than I felt. The dinner was warm and loud and full of the noise that a family gathering produces when everyone is happy. Sophie made a speech that was funny and self-deprecating and made two of her friends cry. Her boyfriend proposed a toast with a grin that told me he'd been rehearsing it for days. I watched Claire laughing across the table and felt the particular grief of knowing that something is about to change and cannot be stopped. Dessert had just been cleared when Derek stood and tapped his wine glass. "I just want to say a few words," he said, smiling around the table. "This is such a special day. Sophie, we're so proud of you. And I want to take a moment to acknowledge the person who made so much of this possible, Harold." He turned toward me with an expression I recognized now as performance. "Dad, your generosity over the years has been extraordinary. This family wouldn't be what it is without you. We love you, and we want to make sure you're always taken care of." The phrase hung in the air, always taken care of. I saw Patricia's jaw tighten slightly at the far end of the table. I stood. "Thank you, Derek." My voice was calm. 40 years of boardrooms. Since we're sharing, I have something I'd like to say as well. A toast of my own. Claire smiled. Sophie leaned forward. The table settled into expectant quiet. This past week, I received some documents that I want to share with everyone here, because I believe the people at this table deserve to know the truth about certain plans that have been made. I reached into my jacket pocket and set 3 folded pages on the table in front of me, the Alderton and Cole filing, the email chain with Dr. Forsyth, the first page of Derek's spreadsheet. 9 weeks ago, my daughter and her husband contacted a lawyer and a psychiatrist to begin the process of having me declared mentally incompetent under the BC Representation Agreement Act. I kept my voice level as I said it. Not because I am incompetent, because Derek has accumulated $340,000 in gambling debts, and Fraser Valley Timber Supply represents the fastest way to pay them. The table went completely silent. Sophie said very quietly, "Grandpa." "Dad, that's..." Claire started. "I'm going to finish." I picked up the page with Derek's spreadsheet. This document was prepared by Derek. It's a financial analysis of my company's assets, calculating the liquidation value at approximately $4.1 million. There's a note in the margin in Derek's handwriting. More than enough. Derek reviewed September 14th. I looked at him directly. September 14th was the Saturday of the Thanksgiving long weekend. "You told me you were fishing in Squamish with your brother." Derek's face had gone the particular gray of a man watching everything collapse simultaneously. "The psychiatric assessment was scheduled for next Tuesday," I continued. "I've spent the past 3 days undergoing comprehensive cognitive evaluations with 3 independent physicians at St. Paul's Hospital. Their written conclusions are with my lawyer." I nodded toward Martin's table, where he raised a hand briefly. "I am entirely competent. I am also, as of Thursday afternoon, in possession of a completely revised will, a new corporate ownership structure for Fraser Valley Timber, and a formal complaint filed with the Law Society of BC regarding Alderton and Cole." Claire had started crying. Not the theatrical kind, real, helpless. The kind that means someone has just understood the full weight of what they've done. "I want to address something before I sit down," I said, and I looked at Sophie. "Your education fund is untouched. The trust I set up for you when you were 4 years old has been moved to an independent trustee, and neither of your parents can access it. That was always yours, and it still is." Sophie's eyes were filled with tears. She looked at her mother the way you look at someone you love and don't recognize. Derek stood abruptly, his chair scraping back. "This is insane. Harold, you've completely misunderstood." "Sit down," I said. Just those 2 words, quietly. He sat. "I also want to acknowledge someone at this table." I looked toward Patricia, who met my eyes steadily. Patricia has worked for Fraser Valley Timber for 22 years. She saw what was happening, and she took a personal risk to make sure I knew about it. "Patricia, I owe you more than I can say in a toast." She nodded once, her eyes bright. I picked up my wine glass. To Sophie, "Congratulations, sweetheart. Your grandmother would have been so proud of you." I drank, set the glass down, and sat. The dinner dissolved after that. Sophie's friends drifted toward the bar in confused clusters. Bill from the mill sat very still with the expression of a man who has witnessed something he'll be talking about for years. Jessica's parents excused themselves with the careful politeness of people desperate to be elsewhere. Martin came to my side quietly and said he'd handle the next steps, and I thanked him and shook his hand, and he left. Claire found me in the entrance hall as I was putting on my coat. Derek was still at the table with his head in his hands. Sophie had gone outside with her friends. Dad. She said it like she was trying out whether it still meant anything. Claire. I looked at my daughter, the woman I had loved since the moment I first held her, and I felt an exhaustion that went deeper than anything physical. I don't want to have a conversation tonight. I'm not capable of it tonight. I didn't want. She stopped. Started again. Derek told me it was just a precaution. He said you'd been making mistakes, that the accountants were worried, that we were protecting you. Were you protecting me when you signed the affidavit that described my cognitive decline? She didn't answer that. Her chin was trembling. Go home, I said. Take care of Sophie. She's going to need you tonight more than I do. I walked out into the October evening. The air off Burrard Inlet was cold and clean, the kind of cold that feels honest. I found my truck in the parkade and sat in it for a while before starting the engine, listening to the sound of the city. Patricia texted as I was driving over the Portman Bridge. Are you okay? I thought about the question for a moment, watching the Fraser River below. I will be, I typed back at the next red light. Thank you, Patricia, for everything. I mean that. Her reply came immediately. I've worked for you for 22 years. You treated me like a person every single day of that. It wasn't a hard decision. I drove home to Chilliwack with the radio off. Derek resigned from his financial advisory firm before I'd filed any formal complaint. It turned out someone at the dinner had known his employer. And word travels fast in a city like Vancouver. The private lenders he owed money to were not interested in waiting while his situation resolved. And within 6 weeks, he and Claire had listed their house in Coquitlam. The equity, after paying those debts, left them very little to start over with. Martin finalized the new corporate structure in November. Fraser Valley Timber Supply's ownership was restructured through a family trust with independent trustees, insulated against any future legal challenge. The original succession plan, which had left everything to Claire, was replaced with a new document that directed the company eventually to its senior employees through a structured buyout arrangement, with a portion directed to an environmental land trust in the Chilcotin. Margaret would have liked that. I heard from Claire twice in December. The first time was a letter, handwritten, that took responsibility in the careful, measured way of someone who has been advised by a counselor to use careful, measured language. The second time was a phone call on Christmas Eve, brief and fragile, during which she said she was sorry, and I said I believed her, and neither of us knew what to say after that. Sophie called me on New Year's Day. She'd moved into an apartment in Kitsilano with 2 of her friends from the program and had been offered a research position starting in February. She talked for an hour about the job and her apartment and a documentary she'd watched about old-growth restoration in the Carmana Valley. She didn't mention her parents at all, and I didn't bring them up, and at the end of the call she said, Grandpa, I just want you to know, I know you, and I know what they were going to do wasn't okay. I thanked her. I told her I was proud of her. I told her to call more often. After I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time with a cup of tea that went cold, looking out the window at the snow on the backyard. Margaret had planted a row of ornamental cherry trees along the fence 15 years ago. In the spring, they bloomed pink and spectacular for about 10 days, and then it was over. And every year I looked forward to those 10 days more than I could rationally explain. Patricia has been promoted to general manager. She runs the day-to-day operations of Fraser Valley Timber with a steadiness that reminds me of myself at 40. And I've told her as much, and she rolled her eyes in exactly the way you'd hope a good general manager would. I drive up to the Okanagan sometimes to check on the cabin that Margaret and I bought in '98. The lake is still there. The mountains are still there. I sit on the dock in the mornings with coffee and watch the light come up over the water, and I think about what it means to have spent 40 years building something, and what it costs to protect it, and whether the cost was worth what it did to my family. I don't have a clean answer to that. I suspect I never will. The cedar jewelry box sits on Sophie's desk in her Kitsilano apartment. She sent me a photograph of it the week she moved in, positioned in the sunlight beside her window. Her initials in the carved lid, the grain of the wood warm and golden in the afternoon light. $820 and 6 weeks of a craftsman's work for something that would last a lifetime. Some things are worth protecting. The hard part is learning which ones and what protecting them actually costs. The victories, when they finally come, don't feel the way you expect. I know that now. But I would make the same choices again. And I think knowing that being certain of it without any satisfaction attached is probably the closest thing to peace I'm going to find.